Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. Today I'm joined by Alastair Davey, and we are going to be talking all about strategy. So how do we go about creating a strategy in safety, and why is it important to take a strategic approach? As you'll hear, Alastair has got some great experience in this area, having overseen safety for a massive company called Sodexo for 10 plus years. And we talk about his learnings, his insights, and what you can go away and implement in your business to ensure that you're taking a strategic approach to safety. Hope you enjoy it. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today, Alastair.
Pleasure. Good to be with you, Christian. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. I'm well. We're recording this during the Easter holidays, so I am not working full-time at the moment. I'm sort of juggling health, childcare and all of the fun stuff around that. But all is good, so can't complain too much.
Good
stuff. So I thought I'd start by asking you, how does it feel to kind of oversee the health, safety and welfare of hundreds of thousands of staff spread across the globe?
Interesting question. So you're referring to, formerly I was global vice president of HSE for Sodexo until a couple of years ago with nearly, I think at its peak we were about 500,000 employees, probably 1,500 safety professionals in the immediate function underneath myself. How does it feel? A bit scared. When I first took on I go back right to the beginning, when I first took on the director role, a bit scary actually. I definitely wasn't ready to take on the role. I joined the company as head of group internal audit in London. I've come out 10 years out of oil and gas, so clearly high hazard industry, and saw there were lots of improvements that are possible at Sodexo because of my experience from that. And I went and looked at health and safety because it wasn't really a big focus. And I wrote some audit reports, looked at the US, looked at Europe. We reported into the chair at that time, Pierre Ballon, who was the founder. And I remember those reports being pushed back across the table to me. And the words were something to the effect of, well, I think you need to sort this out, Alastair. And my response was, what, me? Because I'd done a lot of work in risk, governance, control. I'd been around the world. I'd seen lots of stuff, but I wasn't a safety professional at that time. So that felt pretty daunting. I went on a massive learning curve and still on that learning curve today, of course. I really enjoyed the role. So in terms of how it felt, I loved the role. I loved working with the people. I loved working with both the leaders and the teams at all levels of the organization. It was extremely challenging, pushed me to the absolute limits. In a positive way. I think we grow and develop when we so it was a very, very challenging, very interesting, but I did feel, as you would expect, a heavy, perhaps too much at times, I felt a heavy responsibility, a heavy sense of responsibility that what I was doing and what I was helping the leadership and the teams to do at the company had a real serious real life impact on our people. We're talking about health and safety, we're talking about ultimately injury and life and death. So a combination of perhaps all of those things, Christian, to answer your question.
Well, I thought that was an interesting starting point, because firstly I like to get into something a little bit emotive to start with in these interviews, but I thought it was an interesting piece of context for the discussion that we're planning to have about the importance of strategy and safety, because obviously if you're dealing with such a large organization with, as you say, 500,000 staff spread across the world, then you need to be strategic. You can't be tactical, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons and I was lucky enough, fortunate enough do to be able to design and deploy 2 5-year strategies. So I actually sat in the global leadership role for health and safety for over a decade. And I think part of the reason I was able to do that was being very strategic about how I thought about the business, and before that, how I thought about my own role. So I really, from early on, I viewed partly because I didn't really know fully what I was doing in the beginning. I viewed my role as being to support and enable the senior leaders and everyone else, their teams, and everyone in the organization. So to support and enable them to be safe and healthy in what they did, and it wasn't about me. So I think that really helped, because my focus all the way through was on supporting either the HSE teams that were reporting to me, or and the leaders and the people of the organisation. And the strategy, the strategic piece, I think really didn't so much come from me. Again, I was fortunate to work for, 3 CEOs that come top of mind who I worked for, who were highly experienced, understood the importance of business strategy in terms of engaging and enrolling leaders in the whole organisation and getting things done, and kind of were kind enough to work with me and help me to think about health and safety strategically, and guide me in writing health and safety strategies, and then obviously get those deployed.
And we obviously met last year when you were doing a talk at a sort of safety and sustainability kind of event, which and I was really impressed with your kind of passion for this subject. So you've kind of alluded to it a bit, but where would you say that kind of passion comes from?
Passion for, well, I think, probably there's two things. So I've mentioned the work piece. There's also, one of my, and clearly I'm passionate for lots of reasons. I'm passionate about health and safety, and I've got lots of personal stories and sort of organization stories about that. But also in my personal life, one of my passions is sailing. Always has been. So whether that's coastal sailing, hopping from one port to the next, or more adventurous, crossing the North Sea, or going further afield, and I think that that's another area where I've learned an enormous amount about how do you achieve an objective with a group of people in the face of what are frankly serious risks. If you put out to sea in any boat, you are at risk, and if you don't know what you're doing, you can expect to be, what can we say? You can expect to be punished. Some people, I think, people say,
bad outcomes. Yeah,
the sea will extract the maximum revenge possible, from your errors. So I think that's like, I very much apply that. I apply the things that I've learned at sea to maybe just to give you, maybe a metaphor, and is that, when I'm out, I've got a small sailing yacht, which has got a cabin so you can stay on board, what have you. But when I look at that, I think about risk and managing risk. 2 things come to mind. One is it's got a big aluminium mast on top of it, big heavy thing which is held up by wires, which you can imagine if that came down, that would be that could be very bad. So and the other thing is you want to keep the water out of the hull, right? So you don't want to sink. So everything I do on the boat starts with those 2 things in mind from a sort of macro point of view. How do we keep the water out, and how do we keep the mast up? But then when you've understood that macro view, so you've got to have the wide angle lens, and I think this applies to business and everything else we do. You've then got to zoom in. You need your microscope, because when you start thinking about, well, what actually holds that mast up, for example, there are hundreds of little connectors and toggles, and when you get into the detail of how those work and how they fit together, well, you get into the minutiae. Well, if I put this pin in this way rather than that way, it's more at risk and it might fall out, and then I might lose the mast, or how far back is the split pin bent, all this. So I think that, I apply that as well. Apply the lessons from my life sailing to work as well.
Yeah, always love a good analogy. I was a keen poker player when I was young, and I used that as an analogy for kind of the mathematics of risk and taking decisions based on probabilities and and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's amazing how you can draw inspiration from things you do away from work, but that helps to make these stories and analogies more resonant, and therefore make the impact and the influence that you want them to have.
Sure.
So if we take a step back then and we think about this question of a strategic view, operational health and safety strategies, what would you say the kind of state of play is, based on your experience? And obviously you've only worked in the organizations you've worked in, but just knowing what you know around, what's the state of play currently, and does that vary by sector? So are some sectors better at this than others, or does it vary by size? Are bigger organizations better than smaller, for example?
In terms of strategy, or in terms of health and safety generally, I'm not quite sure.
I'd say in terms of the strategy piece around safety.
Yeah.
What's your sense of that?
I think it's evolving. I think, I obviously talked to quite a lot of people, in networks and with the work that I do. I think it's definitely evolving, and it's hard to generalize. I find it really hard to generalize about these topics because organizations are so different. And I think that's one of the important points about strategy, which is that, and health and safety, which is that there are, in a way, every answer is right, but every answer is also wrong, depending on where you are, what sort of organization you are in, what sort of maturity you're at. My learning from Sodexo, and also, as I say, other experiences, is that when it comes to strategy and thinking about how we improve health and safety, that we really need to lean into the strengths of the organization that we're working with. So, the going in and saying, well, this looks really bad, as I have done, this looks really, really bad. Where we are isn't good. This doesn't look good at all. So let's try and change it. Let's work on these weaknesses and change all of that. Is, in my experience, probably not a winning strategy. Looking at an organization as a dynamic entity, living entity, and saying, right, what are its strengths? How did it survive this long? It's successful in the marketplace. How did it get here? What is it really good at? And then obviously the flip side of that is, well, it's got some weaknesses as well. But then ask yourself the question, okay, how do I play to those strengths? How can I leverage those strengths to get what I want? So as an example, when I first started in the role at Sodexo, I saw that we didn't have the company had grown massive growth over the years, phenomenally successful, and had grown like in a decentralized way. So we didn't have a lot of global policy standards, all of that stuff that you would kind of look for, perhaps as a safety professional. And I looked at that and thought, well, there's a big gap here. This is not good. It's a weakness. But then I also looked and thought, well, okay, well, what are we really good at? And one thing we were really, really good at was getting our leaders and managers out onto site to talk with our frontline teams. And we were just brilliant at that. They did it all the time. They were always present. We loved it, doing it as an organization. So I then lent into that and added, work to add health and safety into behavior, which of course is really powerful, isn't it? Usually we have the opposite problem. Well, in my experience, limited experience, when you go to organizations, you find the leaders are sat in their headquarters, and perhaps they haven't been out to the site for 6 months, or they haven't. So, so that's probably my, I can't give you, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on strategy across all organizations and give you a kind of I think it is very different, but that would be my first sort of starter for 10 is think about what the strengths are and how can we leverage those?
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because people will often focus on areas for improvement, but there's something around sort of psychology, isn't there, around sort of pleasure and pain. So, are you striving to get a pleasure or an outcome, a desire, or are you sort of running away from the pain? And I think there's a lot of studies around this, but that you can get that initial movement from the pain and getting away from the pain, but actually to achieve that kind of sustained effort, sustained outcomes over a period of time, it needs to be focused on the sort of positive side. So I'd agree with you there that I think the focusing on what organizations or people as well are good at and working on that is kind of an accelerant or a booster, and trying to get them away from where they feel passionate and happy and a sense of achievement into sort of looking at where they're less strong is kind of almost demotivating in some respects, I guess.
No, I think what you said is brilliant, and you're right. I mean, there are many studies. I'm thinking of that abound human biases. Um, with Kahneman and Tversky and others that we really overemphasize and focus on a loss,
Mm.
much more than we do on the positive. So, and you're right, as you move across that maturity curve, the sort of the DuPont Bradley curve from the left hand side, which is all about focusing on the negatives. Of course, it should shift and become more about positivity and creation on the right hand side. And it was something that I really focused on in my work at Sodexo, was trying to, as far as possible, try to make sure that we had far more positive stories and positive communications and engagement than negative. So for every accident or incident was communicated, can we have 10 positive stories?
Mm.
Can we have, and we had global safety awards and things like that. So as much as possible, try and generate this positive feeling and align it with, on that point, align it with professionalism, because, when I go to sea on a boat, I really view that I'm to be professional, I've got to really take care of the health and safety of the people who are with me. And I think so, building that ethos in the organization where it's not considered professional to be successful unless you're taking care of health. So you can deliver your revenues, your profits, all the rest of it, but actually, if you're not taking care of health and safety, are you actually being professional in your job, and are you doing a good job? And the answer is more than likely not. And I had some great data on this in Sodexo. I have to be careful. I don't speak for Sodexo. I didn't give a disclaimer.
No, of course,
I'm speaking in a personal, but I will tell a few anecdotes that are interesting, and I'm sure they won't they won't mind me saying it. But we did some great work on engagement and we had a global engagement survey, looking at the engagement survey and then comparing that with both business outcomes, so revenue growth, profits, but also health and safety. How safe people felt. Safety, health and well-being, and you see these. If you do that statistical analysis, you see this very positive and clear correlation. If you've got higher employee engagement, you've got better business results and better health and safety results. And of course, as a safety professional, you say, well, yeah, that's obvious. It makes intuitive, perfect sense to me. You've got better communications, better trust, all the rest of it. But it's just great to have that hard data. So that's another. Maybe it may be helpful for people listening or watching to have a look at your engagement survey and see how that compares with your safety results and also your business results.
Yes, something of a mission that I'm on is a concept which I call profit from safety, which is trying to basically show that safety should be a profit driver for a business rather than a cost. And as you say there, it's all about getting that evidence, because intuitively people can understand that, can't they? But it's kind of, what can we do to achieve that data and draw that line between safety all the way through to profitability? And I think actually what you've highlighted there through engagement is if people feel unsafe, then they're not going to feel engaged. They're not going to feel positive about working in this organization, and therefore they're going to be less productive, and therefore they're going to derive less profit for the business. So again, all these things make perfect sense logically, but it's about how do we draw that line better and evidence that, so that we can get kind of support for it. Because it sounds like you were, Sodexo and other, and you mentioned working in oil and gas. Those are organisations and sectors that I think do buy into the value of safety, but I think there are lots of other sectors that don't so much. And I think trying to provide this evidence base to help safety professionals to get investment, get support, etc., is really, really valuable.
It's certainly one element. I would say I probably wouldn't start there. I started with values, with looking at the mission and goals of the organisation. So back to strategy again, which was, so for Sodexo, the link was perhaps obvious, although it had never been made explicitly until I took on the role, which was that the mission was to make every day a better day, to improve quality of life. So it was relatively easy for me to say, that must start with keeping people safe and healthy, right? Because if you're not safe, then how is your day going to be better than it was before?
Yeah.
So, and I think that was very engaging for people, just to see the connection. This is explicitly part of our mission, and it wasn't an explicit value, and I don't think it is still today. Safety wasn't a value; we had other values, But again, I was able to, one piece of work I did was to tie in how does health and safety support and enable these values, for want of a better way of putting it. But how does it fit?
Yeah.
Why is it part of it? Why is it an essential part of what we do? And I think if you can do that and speak to people, speak to the motivations and the values of people working in the organisation, then that can be quite powerful.
Yeah, no, I love that. So, if let's say I'm in the audience, I'm listening to or watching this, and my organisation doesn't currently have an OHS strategy, how would you sort of suggest that I should go about developing one?
So probably, touching on some of the things you've already said, I think it is very worthwhile to look at and to understand the mission, goals, values of your organisation, because that's what's driving your leaders and the rest of the organisation, right? So you need to find a way and understand how health and safety fits in with that, and be able to talk about that and use the right language. Give you another small example from Sodexo before I go on to any more. But when I mentioned we didn't have global standards and systems when I first took on the role. I had lots of local ones, so the businesses were up, but we didn't have any global ones. But the business had a big ambition to grow with international clients, so household names that operate across the world, and those clients were asking for consistency in what we did. So it was very easy for me to just sort of tie into that and say, well, part of this consistency they're looking for is health and safety standards, so we need some global health and safety standards, and that will enable us to grow and get more business with this target market, which it did actually. So understand the direction and tie into that, and then I think it's back. Then I think it's really down to, okay, what does it take to drive and improve health and safety? And obviously, there's a lot of literature and a lot of experience on that. I can explain what we did in Sodexo and what the key elements of the strategy. We had 4 key elements to the strategy. The first one was leadership. First one was leadership and culture. So before I say that thing, actually, the whole thing was centered on care for people and risk. So a laser focus on risk. So making sure that we understand what the biggest risks are and we manage those. So that sort of was in the center, and what we called a zero harm mindset. So we never said we're going to have 0 accidents, but we said we have a mindset that's about zero harm.
Yeah,
that's important. We can maybe come back to that. But the 4 elements, the first one was leadership and culture. So do your leaders understand their responsibility for creating the culture of the organization, which we all know is fundamental to and critical to safety? So in my experience, leaders either they understand it and they're proactively creating a culture, which may or may not involve health and safety, or they simply haven't thought about that. They don't understand it because they've never had the opportunity to learn about that, in which case your culture kind of evolves randomly, right? In response to accidents and incidents, you change things because something goes wrong, and which is clearly not optimal. So leadership, first of all, your leaders need to understand what it is you want to do and how you want to do it. That isn't enough. That's clearly absolutely essential, but that isn't enough. Those leaders then got to engage their teams and enroll them in that journey as well. So that's where the communications piece. So communications was the second leg, communications and engagement. And again, we can come back to these and unpack them a bit more if you like, but communicating through the organization in a very simple, clear way that engages people is clearly essential.
Yeah,
that clearly isn't enough, because okay, I've got the message, I understand what we're doing, I get how it all fits in, but do I know how to be safe, how to work safely, how to set the right example? Well, you could argue that we all have common sense, right? I would argue there's no such thing.
My wife sometimes argues that I don't have any common sense.
I would argue common sense is, somebody once said to me, common sense is that which is obvious once it's explained, right?
Yeah, so that's a good definition. Yeah.
We only have common sense because we've learned something at some point in our lives, if you think about it. So I start with the premise that there's no such thing as common sense. You have to learn, and there are lots of reasons why we have to learn about safety in the workplace, as most people listening to this podcast will know, because it's very different, right? You've got automated machinery, you've got complex systems. You've got chemicals that you would never see in the home, so you clearly need to be trained and understand what it's doing. So that's the third leg. And then the fourth leg was all about organizational learning.
Yeah.
So learning to your point earlier about positive, learning from the good and the bad. So we know that we have far more things go right every day than go wrong at work and at home, because we have so many days where we have no accident. So why is that? Why are things going well? How is it that we manage to be safe? So learning from that, but of course, vitally also learning from any accidents or incidents. And then those sort of four elements that I've just described created the fundamental enablers of the strategy, and there were the pillars of the strategy, and then everything else was driven through that. So whenever we had an initiative or an activity, it was always linked back to this strategy wheel, if you like. It was a circle, so we had the center, the zero accident mindset, and the circle, and everyone was clear about, okay, this is a leadership initiative. This is what it tackles. This is how it addresses X, Y, or Z. And a very deliberate. I mean, I think if you step back from it all, taking the wide angle lens again, I was very conscious that we needed two things to deliver on health and safety. One was processes, systems, tools, that piece, and the other was culture. So in the strategy very deliberately addressed for each element both the processes that we needed and the tools, but it also addressed the culture. So what's the future state of culture? We actually described what the future culture should look like. How would people act? How would they behave? What would they do? And then, deliberately put initiatives in place to actually help us move towards that future state.
Yeah. And this was this kind of positioned as like a flywheel almost. So in other words, the leadership goes to the comms, the training to the learning, and that supports the leadership, and and it kind of works around like that.
Absolutely, little bit like the sort of plan, do, check, act loop, but a little bit. Like the idea was you go, you at least intuitively you go around the circle and understand you need to have all those elements in place.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. So let's just go a little bit deeper then on this kind of zero harm mindset. So I've spoken before about zero harm to people on the podcast, and obviously it's something that has quite strong opinions around it. So give me your perspective on that, and why you carefully and deliberately, I'm sure, chose the phrase of zero harm mindset.
Well, initially, the first working version was zero accident mindset. So we had I remember we had a big discussion when I took on the first role right at the beginning about goal zero. Now, bear in mind, I came out of oil and gas, and I'd sort of operated under goal zero and seen some of the things that entails and some of the potential consequences of goal zero. And I saw that it could get it could be quite self-defeating. What you got and again, it depends on where you are in the maturity curve and exactly what you're trying to achieve. I think goal zero, in a less mature organization can be great, right? Because you're perhaps having hundreds of accidents and you want to get that down. You're like, we want zero accidents, and it's great. Mobilize everyone around it. It could be fantastic, right? But when you get to a more mature, over the more right-hand side of the curve, and you've got less and less accidents, the goal zero can become, it can pour cold water on what you're trying to achieve in terms of culture, of course, because it naturally can suppress reporting, which is completely contrary to what you're looking for. If you can imagine the pressure. You've gone, whatever it is, 2, 3, 5 years on your site, your platform, without an accident, and there's a big zero, or big number outside every time you walk into a door. What happens when you have an accident, and that pressure so it can really, right. So I kind of came in fighting against goal zero, and I dug my heels in. I said, I cannot do this job if we have goal zero. And so it was a compromise. Just why don't we have, we talked about zero accident strategy also. So why don't I have zero accident mindset? So the idea is we all have a mindset that we want zero accidents, but that isn't the what's the best way to say? We're not setting that as a target.
It's not a measurable metric, and everything points to that zero, and if we don't achieve that zero, we failed.
Yeah, and also it's it's a bit deeper than that, and it needs to be explained, doesn't it? Because it's so your accident rate is historic. I've never had a serious accident driving my car for the last 30 years. Doesn't mean I'm a safe driver, right? I might just have been lucky. And also, it says nothing about how I'm going to drive today or tomorrow. But worse than that, when you think about an organization, if we've got 0 accidents, it doesn't actually tell us. It doesn't tell us that we're safe, does it? It's what we call. I think I heard Jeff Bezos talking about it the other day. It's what he calls a false proxy. It's a bit like I don't have any customer complaints, so are my customers happy? Well, not necessarily. You may have some quite bad quality problems. So we take the 0 and we say, that means we're safe. Everything's great. It's good. Well, actually, we're not. So that's a problem. So a 0 accident mindset was just say, look, we need to have this mindset where we have 0 accidents, but we're not going to reward people for being 0. We're not going to drive 0 that hard, because actually we want reporting, and we have, as leaders, we have to sort of hate the fact we've had an accident report. We also have to really welcome it, because that's our vital information for us to improve and learn and be safer in the future. So and then, because we then started focusing on health later on, it became 0 harm, which was just the idea was just to be more holistic. So I don't know if that explains it. It's a difficult one, isn't it? It's a difficult topic to get underneath and really explain clearly in words.
I did 2 episodes with Simon Cassin. I don't know if you've come across Simon, but he works in the field of ethics, and he did a dissertation about, is the 0 harm approach to safety ethically justifiable?
I listened to that. I listened to him actually. That was interesting. Yeah.
So we unpacked all of that, and one of the key things that came out to me from that was this question of harm, because I think the example Simon gave was, we might say we're going to ban parking on our construction site, because that's going to mean that there's 0 risk of harm of somebody getting run over. But then if we're parking our cars on side streets around the site, we're adding to the potential harm for other people, but that wouldn't be reflected on our accident statistics, and therefore is that really achieving 0 harm? And it's just, and thinking more broadly about that question of harm, as you say, bringing health into the equation. Does to me make more sense.
And of course it's got to be, as I mentioned, it's got to be risk focused, because we've got these just an infinite number of risks, things that could happen, but we really have to. And a lot of my time in that leadership role was spent making sure we were focused on the biggest risks. I have to give the example of paper cuts. I once read a fatality report that was a paper cut, believe it or not, and then tragic. This individual had suffered a paper cut in the office, and it had led to a very bad infection, which had then resulted in a fatality. Are we going to ban all paper in our offices? The answer is no, of course. And with respect to, clearly, without wishing to be offensive in any way to people with severe haemophilia and other conditions where a paper cut might well be life-threatening. For most people, it's not life-threatening. And while we've got people working at height, working in confined spaces, working with electricity, etc., all these things that we know are very high risk and can kill people, clearly we've got to apply our resources to those highest risk areas. So in a way, you're right. We tolerate a certain level of risk. We can only look at the legend. We want to be as low as reasonably practicable, right? We can't have. There's no such thing as 0 risk. What we absolutely don't tolerate is serious accidents and fatalities. We have to have a 0 tolerance for these, and that requires a very positive approach, and making sure your reporting system is working really, really well, and that you've got more, as much leading and positive indicators coming through your reporting system as possible, like the good cholesterol, right? If you think about the reporting system as your cardiovascular system, you've got your bad cholesterol, which is, if you, in a way, it's not a good analogy, but is the accidents and the negative stuff. But you want to get all the positive, really focus on the leading indicators and things that you think are driving safety, and get those coming through the system. So it also gets people in the habit of reporting, right?
Reports on the leading indicators rather than the accidents as much. I like that. So in terms of those kind of 4 key pillars, then, Which of them would you say, either in your experience or kind of more generally, do you think would be perhaps the most challenging to put into place? And have you got any stories or examples or philosophies, thoughts on kind of how to perhaps overcome those kinds of challenges or objections?
I think they're all challenging in their own way. I think the leadership is, leadership is so important, and I think as a profession we probably struggle with that one. I think we may struggle with that one more perhaps more than some of the others, because sometimes it can be difficult. The reality is these are health and safety roles are extremely difficult jobs. They're super challenging, and often they can be underappreciated. So you get you don't get recognised when things go well because there's been no accident. So it's like nothing to see there. And then you have an accident. It's like, well, where were you? Yeah. And I'm not just speaking my own. I'm just reflecting what people say to me. When I network with other peers and safety professionals, and it can be seen as a low status role. Can be reporting low down in the organization, can have difficulty accessing leadership team, difficulty getting on the agenda. I think it can be difficult as well when we're in these professional roles where we're perhaps recruited and paid to be a technical expert. And then suddenly actually to get, let's say to get a strategy in place, as we're talking about, you need to become adept and fluent at dealing with senior leaders and influencing them and all these other things that perhaps are not part of your training and experience. So I think I expect the leadership one to be particularly challenging. And the others, I think on the communications, I think there's a lot of skill and expertise out there among the profession around how to communicate well around health and safety. There's a lot of expertise around, training, coaching, and helping people to understand what they need to do safely. There is, in terms of the learning piece, I think we're probably not bad. We're pretty good at learning from accidents. I'm not sure how good we are at learning from, how work is done day to day and why work is safe day to day, generally safe, let's say.
And learning from that, but also communicating that, because if an accident happens, then something binary has happened. Whereas how do you communicate the learning from the avoidance? How do you prove that you did something that prevented something from happening? That's quite difficult, isn't it?
And it's this massive difficulty when we look back at the past. Everything's obvious, right? I mean, okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit because, of course, when you're faced with a real world accident investigation, you don't know what's happened, and it's a massive challenge to get all the data, the statements together, and work out what happened. But when you look back at it, you say, oh well, it was obvious what happened. There was this linear path of events, causal chain of events that happened. When you look into the future, it doesn't look like that at all. It's completely uncertain. It could veer off in an infinite number of directions, and all sorts of things could happen. So I think that we struggle with that as a profession, I think, and that's why we end up with quite often with blaming employees. A lot of this, I know there's there's been a lot of work done on that in recent years to move away from that, but it is, it is look back and say, well, that was obvious. A bit like the comments say, that was obvious, wasn't it? Well, no, actually it wasn't. If you really put yourselves in the shoes of that individual, it wasn't obvious. It clearly wasn't obvious at all to them. Otherwise they wouldn't have made the decision that they made, and they were just trying to make the best decision in the circumstances. So I think that's a challenge. And then, as you say, looking forward, one thing I like to do, I think the opposite of root cause analysis for me is what I would call what if analysis. But looking forward into the future and saying, well, what if? And I think this is extremely helpful whether you're on a yacht sailing across an ocean or in a business. But what if X happened? And running through those scenarios. That is really how I get real and clear on what the risks are that I'm facing for myself and for the team, and how I can start to plan and think about how I would react to those scenarios should they occur.
Yeah, so almost like a business continuity kind of planning, think about all these different scenarios, question, don't just accept. I think one of the big challenges is, we've always done it that way, or that's good enough. It's those kind of mindsets we've got to challenge, isn't it? So that kind of what if analysis, I like that, because that forces you to take a slightly contrary position and think, well, are there things we could do better? Are we doing enough here or not?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to my comments on professionalism, and really creating an ethos where to be professional means taking care of health and safety, and we recognize and reward people for that, and people and individuals we all take that on board, and we consider ourselves and we look at other people and say, wow, they're really, really good at their job, and part of that is how they look at health and safety.
Yeah that would be a nice place for us all to be, wouldn't it? So Alastair, tell us a bit about the relatively new business, what you're doing, how you can support people, the kind of projects you're going to be working on, and areas you're focusing in.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of finished completed my quite a long corporate career doing lots of different things, as I alluded to before. So I think I've finished my corporate career in terms of full-time leadership roles. So I'm now I've started a new venture, which is called Essensol. So that's Echo Sierra Echo November Sierra Oscar Lima, occasionally, and you can find that essensol.com. And the idea of this, what I wanted to do is, I spent a bit of time thinking about what do I want to do with the sort of second phase of my life now that I finished this corporate career, and I thought, well, what value can I add? And in a way, in a real way, what can I give back to this community of professionals who've given me such a great, career and such enjoyment? And I love working with people who work in health and safety. They're just a great bunch of, people with great integrity and great values. So I thought, well, what I can do is I can actually find ways to help out with health and safety. So I'm continuing to work with large corporates. But what I wanted to do, and I haven't done this yet, this is something very new with Essensol, is say, okay, how can I help safety professionals, health and safety professionals? So there's my wife and I founded this organization. She's a health professional. She works on mental health and well-being. So, okay, and when I was professional going through my career, there were some major challenges that I faced, and I didn't always have the help that I needed. So can we find a way to create a network with for professionals where they can come with their specific challenges and we can work on those? Now, initially, that might be myself and my wife working, one-on-one, or maybe we do a small webinar. But the idea is if we can create a network of people around problems, those specific issues that they got, whether they can't access the leadership team or their accident rates are flatlining or whatever it might be, and then create this network, this community of expertise, and create some, for me, what would it be in it for me and for Essensol is we create some intellectual property, right? We create some learning, some materials that we can then pass on. And the idea is to do this cheaply, right? Make it affordable, pass on through webinars or other materials. So that's the idea. So you can find, if that's of interest to you, you've got a professional challenge that you're facing that you'd like some help with, and we'll do this completely for free to start with. We just want to get the ball rolling. Then get over to either find me on LinkedIn, get over to essensol.com. There's a sign up page there. Sign up, and then let's see where it goes. And if we can, as I say, from my point of view, I'd like to give something back. Need to pay the costs, of course, of running the office and the website, but I'm not doing this to make money. I'm doing it because I want to add something, give something back, and and help the community. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, Alastair. Really enjoyed that chat. Lots to reflect on and dig into, and some great learning points there. So encourage people to listen back even with a notepad and take some notes and start working on getting this strategic bit right. So really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And thanks to you for joining. Yeah, go on.
No, I was going to say it's a real pleasure, and thanks to you, Christian, for hosting. I think you do a great job. Very much enjoyed listening to it, and great to thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. And thanks to you for joining Alastair and I, and we'll look forward to seeing you on another episode of the podcast soon. Cheers.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.